It was a Sunday night in November 1875, and the fog was rolling off the Thames, covering London in a thick yellow blanket. In the exclusive clubs of St. James and the grand dining rooms of Mayfair, the most powerful men in the world were finishing their dinners. They were discussing the usual topics of the Victorian era, which were the price of coal, the unrest in Ireland, and the endless expansion of the British Empire. But in a private room at 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli was not eating, he was pacing. He was holding a secret telegram that had just arrived from Cairo. The paper was thin and the handwriting was hurried, but the message it contained was heavy enough to sink a battleship. The telegram said that the Khedive of Egypt was broke. It said that the ruler of the most strategic piece of land on earth was drowning in debt and was desperate to sell his most prized asset. That asset was the Suez Canal. To understand why this telegram made the Prime Minister of Great Britain sweat, we have to understand what the world looked like in 1875. This was the peak of the Industrial Revolution. Steamships were the arteries of the global economy, and the Suez Canal was the heart. Before the canal was built, a ship traveling from London to Mumbai had to sail all the way around the continent of Africa. It was a dangerous voyage that took months. But when the Suez Canal opened in 1869, it sliced through the desert and connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It cut the journey to India in half. For the British Empire, which relied on India for its wealth and power, the canal was not just a ditch in the sand. It was the jugular vein of the empire. If the canal closed, the British economy would have a heart attack. If another power like France or Russia controlled the canal, they could hold Britain hostage. And that was the problem. Britain did not own the canal. In fact, Britain had hated the canal when it was first proposed. The British engineers called it impossible, and the British politicians called it a French plot. The canal was built by a Frenchman named Ferdinand de Lesseps, and it was owned by a French company. The stocks were split. The French investors owned just over half, and the Khedive of Egypt owned the rest. For years, the British watched helplessly as French ships and French flags dominated the most important waterway in the world. But now, on this foggy Sunday night, the balance of power was about to shift. The Khedive of Egypt was putting his shares up for sale. The man selling the shares was Ismail Pasha. He was a man of immense ambition and tragic flaws. When Ismail came to power, he looked at the dusty streets of Cairo and decided that he would turn them into the Paris of the Nile. He wanted Egypt to be a modern European power. He famously said, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe." And he spent money as if this were true. He built opera houses and palaces. He built thousands of miles of telegraph lines and railways. He hired Italian architects to design new neighborhoods and French chefs to cook his meals. When the Suez Canal opened, he threw the biggest party the world had ever seen. He built a road from the pyramids to the palace just so his guest, the Empress Eugenie of France, would not get dust on her dress. He commissioned Giuseppe Verdi to write the opera Ada. Champagne flowed like water and diamonds were given away like party favors. But there was a dark side to this glamour. Ismail did not have the money to pay for it. He was borrowing it all from European bankers. In the 1860s, during the American Civil War, the price of Egyptian cotton had skyrocketed, and Ismail thought the good times would last forever. But when the war in America ended, the price of cotton crashed. The income stopped, but the spending did not. Ismail kept borrowing. He borrowed at 10%, then 20%, then 20%. The bankers in London and Paris knew he was doomed, but they kept lending him money because the interest rates were so high they could not resist. By 1875, the interest payments alone were consuming almost the entire revenue of the Egyptian state. The Khedive was robbing his own peasants to pay the bankers in Europe. Now it was November, and a major debt payment was due in a few weeks. The treasury in Cairo was empty. The soldiers were unpaid. The teachers were unpaid. The Khedive was facing humiliation and possibly a coup. He had one card left to play. He owned 44% of the Suez Canal Company. It was the family silver. He did not want to sell it, but he had no choice. He quietly let it be known to the French government that he was willing to sell his shares for £4 million. The French were thrilled. If they bought these shares, they would own almost the entire canal. The Mediterranean would become a French lake. The route to India would belong to Paris. But there was a leak. A journalist named Frederick Greenwood heard a rumor at a dinner party. He rushed to the British Foreign Office and told Lord Derby, the Foreign Secretary. Lord Derby told Prime Minister Disraeli, and that is how the telegram ended up at 10 Downing Street. Benjamin Disraeli saw the opportunity immediately. He was a romantic imperialist who believed in the destiny of Britain. He knew that if he could buy those shares, he would secure the route to India forever. He would turn a French project into a British asset. He would pull off the greatest diplomatic coup of the century. But there was a massive problem, a problem that seemed insurmountable. The Khedive needed the money immediately. He needed $4 million by the end of the week, or he would default on his debts. $4 million in 1875 is equivalent to billions of dollars today. It was a colossal sum. Disraeli looked at the calendar and realized he was trapped. The British Parliament was currently in recess. It was not in session. Under British law, the government could not spend a single penny without the approval of Parliament. Disraeli could not simply write a check from the Treasury. If he waited for Parliament to return in a few weeks, the Khedive would be bankrupt, or the French would have already bought the shares. The French government didn't have this problem. They had the cash ready. They were already drafting the contracts. Disraeli sat at his desk and looked at the fire. He was 70 years old, he was tired. He was surrounded by political enemies who wanted to see him fail. His great rival William Gladstone would have been horrified by the idea of spending £4 million on a secret deal. Gladstone believed in peace and retrenchment and saving money. Disraeli believed in action and glory. He knew that if he let this moment pass, it would never come again. He had to find £4 million in 48 hours without telling Parliament and without alerting the French. He called his private secretary, Montagu Corey, into the room. Corey was young and loyal, and he worshipped Disraeli. The Prime Minister looked at him and asked a question that sounded like a joke. He asked, "Where can we find £4 million by Tuesday?" Corey didn't laugh. He knew the old man was serious. They went through the list of options. The Bank of England. The Bank of England was the obvious choice. It was the government's bank. But the governor of the Bank of England was a cautious man. He was bound by strict rules. He would never agree to lend such a massive sum for a secret political gamble without parliamentary approval. He would ask for paperwork. He would ask for a vote. There was no time for votes. Disraeli needed a private source. He needed someone with enough liquidity to move millions in gold at a moment's notice. He needed someone who trusted him personally. He needed someone who understood that this was not just a financial transaction, but a geopolitical masterstroke. There was only one name that fit the description: the Rothschilds. The House of Rothschild was the most powerful financial dynasty in the world. They had branches in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt. They had financed wars and railroads and kings. The head of the London branch was Lionel de Rothschild. He was a personal friend of Disraeli. In fact, they were close. Disraeli had been born Jewish, although he was baptized as a Christian, and he faced immense prejudice in British society. Lionel de Rothschild was the first practicing Jew to sit in the British Parliament, and he had fought for years to take his seat. They shared a bond of outsiders who had reached the pinnacle of power. Disraeli turned to Montagu and gave him a verbal order. He told him to go to the City of London immediately. He told him to go to the offices of M.M. Rothschild and Sons at New Court. He told him to find Lionel de Rothschild and ask him for £44 million. Corey asked what he should offer as security. Security is the collateral you give a bank to guarantee a loan. Usually you offer land or gold or stocks. Disraeli didn't have any of those things. He didn't even have the legal authority to ask for the money. He looked at Corey and said, "Tell him the security is the British government." It was a bluff, a magnificent bluff. Disraeli was betting his entire career and the reputation of the British Empire on a handshake. If Parliament came back and refused to ratify the deal, Disraeli would be ruined. He would be impeached. He might even go to prison for misuse of funds. The Rothschilds would lose their money. The scandal would bring down the government. But Disraeli was a gambler. He had written novels before he became a politician. He understood drama, and he knew that sometimes history is made not by committees, but by individuals who are willing to risk everything on a single roll of the dice. Montagu Corey put on his coat and walked out into the fog. He hailed a carriage and told the driver to take him to the city. The streets were quiet. The gas lamps flickered in the damp air. Corey held his breath. He knew that the fate of the Middle East was riding with him in that carriage. Meanwhile, in Cairo, the Khedive was pacing in his palace. The French agents were pressing him to sign. They had the contract on the table. They told him the British were too slow. They told him the British Parliament would never agree. Ismail stalled them. He was waiting for a signal from London. He preferred the British to the French, but he was a desperate man. If the British didn't come through by tomorrow, he would sign with France and the Suez Canal would be lost to Britain forever. The clock was ticking. Montagu Corey arrived at the headquarters of the Rothschild banking dynasty at New Court. It was not a typical bank. It was a palace of finance. He was ushered into the private room where Lionel de Rothschild was waiting. The legend of this meeting has been told in many ways, but the core of it remains one of the most cinematic moments in financial history. The story goes that the Baron was eating muscatel grapes. He was a man of immense composure. He did not look up when Corey entered. He continued to eat his grapes, spitting the skins and seeds onto a plate. Corey stood there, his heart pounding. He delivered the message from the Prime Minister. He said that Mr. Disraeli needed £4 million tomorrow. Lionel de Rothschild paused. He picked another grape. He asked, "What is your security?" Corey replied exactly as he had been instructed, "The British government." The Baron paused again. He ate the grape. Then he said simply, "You shall have it." Just like that, the deal was done. There were no lawyers present. There were no 20-page contracts. There was no board meeting. It was a gentleman's agreement between the Prime Minister of the world's greatest empire and the head of the world's greatest bank. Rothschild agreed to advance the money immediately, charging a commission and interest, of course, because he was a banker, not a charity. But the speed of the transaction was unprecedented. The Rothschilds began mobilizing their network. They gathered gold and credit from across Europe. They prepared the transfer to Cairo. Back at Downing Street, Disraeli was waiting. When Corey returned with the news, Disraeli was ecstatic. He sat down and wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. The letter is famous for its triumphant tone. He wrote, "It is settled. You have it, madam. The French have been outmaneuvered. We have bought the Khedive's shares. You now possess the key to India." He was jubilant. He felt he had secured the safety of the empire for 100 years. The next day, the money was transferred. In Cairo, the Khedive Ismail received the funds. He was relieved. He paid his immediate debts. He sent the French agents away empty-handed. The British consul general in Cairo marched into the Khedive's palace and took possession of the physical share certificates. They were packed into iron boxes and shipped to England on a warship. The British public went wild with excitement. When the news broke, the newspapers hailed Disraeli as a genius. They loved the boldness of the move. It was seen as a masterstroke of patriotism. Even Gladstone, Disraeli's sore rival, had to admit that the public was on Disraeli's side. But the story does not end with the purchase. In fact, the purchase was just the beginning of the tragedy. The fee $4 million that Disraeli sent to Cairo was a lot of money, but for Khedive Ismail, it was a drop in the bucket. His debts were so massive that the $24 million vanished almost instantly. It went to pay the interest on other loans. Within months, the Khedive was broke again. But this time, things were different. Before the sale, Britain was just an observer in Egypt. Now Britain was a major shareholder. Britain owned almost half the canal. This meant Britain had a direct financial stake in the internal affairs of Egypt. When Ismail announced that he could not pay his debts in 1876, the British government could no longer ignore it. They couldn't say this is a private matter between the Khedive and the banks. Now it was a matter of national interest. The British and French governments sent a commission to Cairo to investigate the Khedive's finances. This was called the Cave Mission. They opened the books and were horrified by what they found. The corruption and waste were staggering. The European powers decided that Ismail could not be trusted with money. They set up a system called the dual control. This was a humiliating arrangement for a sovereign nation. An English official was placed in charge of Egypt's revenue, and a French official was placed in charge of Egypt's expenditure. They effectively took over the Egyptian government. They slashed spending. They raised taxes on the peasants. They cut the pay of the army. They did everything a ruthless bankruptcy lawyer would do, but they did it to an entire country. The Egyptian people were furious. They saw their ruler as a puppet of the Christians. They saw their taxes going to pay Jewish and Christian bankers in London and Paris while their children went hungry. A nationalist movement began to rise. It was led by an army officer named Colonel Ahmed Urabi. He rallied the army and the people with the slogan, "Egypt for the Egyptians." He wanted to kick out the foreign advisors and end the dual control. He wanted to depose the Khedive and establish a parliament. The British government watched this with alarm. They didn't care about Egyptian democracy. They cared about the Suez Canal. They were terrified that a nationalist government would seize the canal or refuse to pay the debts. The bondholders in the city of London were pressuring the government to intervene. They whispered that Urabi was a dangerous radical. They said the canal was in danger. In 1882, the tension exploded. Riots broke out in Alexandria. Europeans were killed. The British government, now led by Gladstone, who had ironically opposed Disraeli's imperialism, felt compelled to act. They sent the Royal Navy to Alexandria. They bombarded the city, destroying the fortifications and setting the city on fire. Then they landed troops. They marched toward Cairo. At the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, the British army crushed Urabi's nationalist forces. The British cavalry rode into Cairo and took control of the citadel. Khedive Ismail had already been deposed by the British and replaced by his son, Tewfik, who was a compliant puppet. The British general announced that they were there only to restore order. He promised they would leave as soon as the Khedive's authority was secure. They said the occupation was temporary, but they never left. The temporary occupation lasted for 72 years. The £4 million loan had turned into a military conquest. This is the true legacy of the Suez Purchase. It changed the nature of the British Empire. Before Suez, Britain preferred to trade with countries rather than rule them. They called it the imperialism of free trade. They didn't want the headache of governing millions of people in the Middle East. They just wanted to sell them cotton and buy their grain. But the debt changed everything. The debt created a chain that pulled Britain deeper and deeper into the desert. Once they bought the shares, they had to protect the shares. To protect the shares, they had to control the Egyptian government. To control the government, they had to occupy the country. To protect the occupation, they eventually had to take control of Sudan and the headwaters of the Nile. It was mission creep on a continental scale. The irony is that Disraeli, the man who bought the shares, died before the occupation began. He never saw British troops marching into Cairo. He thought he had made a clever financial deal. He didn't realize he had started a chain reaction that would define the modern Middle East. The Suez Canal became the obsession of British foreign policy. It dictated their strategy in World War I and World War II. It was the reason they betrayed the Arabs after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It was the reason they drew the borders of the Middle East the way they did. They needed to keep the canal safe at all costs. And what about the Rothschilds? They made a healthy profit on the loan. The British government repaid them the $44 million plus interest as soon as Parliament returned and voted on the bill. The Rothschilds proved once again that they were the indispensable bankers of kings. But for the people of Egypt, the loan was a tragedy. It was the moment their leader sold their future to pay for his past. So when we look back at that dinner in 1875, at the fog outside the window and the grapes on the plate, we are looking at the birth of the modern Middle East. We are looking at the moment when the power of finance superseded the power of sovereignty. The British didn't need to invade Egypt with an army in 1875. They just needed a checkbook. The army came later to collect the bill. The Suez Canal Purchase teaches us a lesson that is still relevant today. Debt is a weapon, And sometimes the most dangerous invasion force is not a regiment of soldiers, but a single piece of paper signed in a quiet room by a desperate man.